What's up everyone? Welcome back to the shop. I want to make something curvy. No, not that. I was thinking maybe a hanging wall cabinet with a sweet arch to it. Now to do an arch like that, we're going to have to do some bent lamination. And if we're going to do bent lamination, that means we need to make a form. The internet told me that the most important thing with bent lamination is to make sure that I have the proper jig to hold it all in place. So I grabbed a whole bunch of MDF and glued it all together. I want my cabinet to be about 5 inches deep, which means I need to make a mold that's, well, taller than that, because I have to make sure that I get adequate clamping pressure across the entire surface. I got out my router jig, which I absolutely love to use, and did half circles. And I just kept lowering down the bit over and over again until I got to the lowest part that I can. Now, obviously this is nowhere near deep enough to cut all the way through. So after I did that, I then flipped it over and did the same thing on the other side. And then with the goal of, well, that's gonna leave me a big strip in the middle that I could probably just clean up with some sandpaper or something like that. Since I want my cabinet to be about 3/4 of an inch thick, I moved my jig in that far and then did more half circles and then did it on the other side as well. For the straightaways, I just went to the bandsaw and slowly cut until I reached that halfway point on the circle to break the pieces into two. After I separated the two pieces, my plan was to clean up that inside part, that middle part I couldn't reach with the router bit, just using a sander. And then I realized, well, that kind of sucks. I don't want to do that. So what I did instead was I used a table saw to slice it in half and break it into two different pieces. By doing that, it allows me to put a really tall flush trim bit into my router table, take the pieces over there, and then flush trim them, get rid of all that inside part that I was not able to clean up. Now, to make sure that all my pieces went back together the way they were supposed to, I drilled some strategic holes for dowels. So this is just for alignment purposes. That way, whenever I go to put these back together, I tap the dowels in, I know everything goes right back to the way it's supposed to be. There was still a little bit of cleanup work to do, but really not too much, which was awesome. And what I'm left with is this really cool arch. So this is exactly the profile that I wanted to have for my cabinet. So I dig it. So now I got to figure out how thick a material can I get so that it bends into that arch there? Because if it's too thick and you try to do it, it could snap, right? But also you don't want to make 1,000 really, really tiny thin pieces because, well, then you have 1,000 of them. So I did some tests and I had a couple pieces of maple that were already really thin, so I could just run them through my drum sander to see what would work. And what it came out to was about 1/16 of an inch, worked good for me. So now I got to grab some walnut and cut those. So if I have 1/16 of an inch strips and I need 3/4 of an inch material, that's like 547 strips. I have all my wood strips here. I did a dry fit, so I know that they fit in there perfectly. Now I did make an interior part for this. So I made a buck that you would slide into place and then clamp it, and that's supposed to apply good clamping pressure across all of the surface. But I just really didn't like it. I didn't like some of the areas that it wasn't really clamping right. So instead, not gonna use that at all. I'm gonna call an audible. I made a bunch of different calls for the interior part here. So I'm just gonna clamp it to the outside. I already tried it. Looks great, so that's what I'm gonna roll with. As far as the adhesives go, most people say to use a Unibond 800 or a Weld Bond when you're doing bent lamination. But those are a little bit too caustic for my taste, so instead I'm gonna go with Titebond Extends. So even though it has a longer open time, I'm gonna work pretty quick.
You can call me stupid. Yes, you can call me sheep. You can say I'm lazy. You can say I'm weak. You think that using her would get to me. And if you're right, then you're in trouble, D. 'Cause I won't break, no, I know I won't wait. You're in trouble, D.
I got it out of the mold and Hey, it looks pretty good. So now I'm gonna work on the base of it. So that's gonna be just a basic piece of walnut. I think I wanna have it overhang the sides just a bit, overhang the front a little bit. Haven't decided if I wanna do bevels or roundovers. I think I need to get the whole thing assembled first, and then I could kind of decide on those design elements. Here's where we get to be super creative because, well, it's just a decorative shelf anyway. We can do whatever we want to do. So what I'm thinking is I'm going to have a drawer down at the bottom here, and then maybe another shelf. I have a divider, and then have a couple drawers, 1 or 2 drawers over on one side, and just have an empty shelf over on the other. So to hold those shelves in place, I think I'm going to cut some dados with a router that I can slide my shelves in. I do want to put a back panel on this, but I'm going to cut those dados out first, and then I'll worry about cutting out the rabbet back here for that back panel. I realize I can cut one set of dados over at the router table with a slight modification. The curve of the cabinet actually prevents me from being able to set the inside face down on the router table and push it all the way up against the fence. So I needed to raise it up just a hair, so I just grabbed some hardboard and some double-sided tape, stuck it together. That did the trick. To prevent any sort of tear out, I used some CA glue and some MDF, glued the pieces together, and made myself a sacrificial fence. I then put that on the front of the cabinet and then used a sacrificial fence on a miter gauge on the back side of the cabinet, and that ensured I got zero tear out whenever the bit entered or exited the board. The upper dados were a little bit trickier. I couldn't use the router table, but I also could not use my big router because there wasn't enough clearance. So instead I turned to the trim router. I used some MDF, some CA glue, and some blue tape to make myself a router guide. I also used some MDF to make myself a larger router base plate. This gives me a lot more surface area. I don't have to worry about the router tipping as it's entering or exiting the board. At the same time, since I am using a trim router, I can't really hog out a lot of material at one time like I can using my bigger router at the router table. So that means I'm taking multiple shallow passes. Well, the more passes you take, the more likely you're going to have a mistake. So having all that surface area just really minimizes that risk. I milled up a walnut board, cut it to length. That made up the bottom and the top shelves. So I dry fit those in there to make sure everything looks good. And hey, I really like it. So at this point, I can assess and figure out what I want to do next. I'm thinking a divider right down the middle, and that will put an open area on one side, and then I could do 2 drawers on the other side. So I got to cut the dados for that divider, and then I also have to cut a dado across the middle of the divider and the inside face here for my drawers. Then I can take all those out, glue this carcass together, and then worry about figuring out that back panel. To cut this last dado that's going to be in the side of our cabinet and then in the side of our divider, I took 2 pieces of MDF, I cut them to size. I can set them in here like this, and then I can use these as router guides. So I'm going to take some blue tape, some CA glue, stick these on here, and then I can take them out and then do the routing. I cut a bevel on the bottom base. Just much easier to do that now than it is to try to do that after it's all glued up. So now I need to glue this big arch onto our base. I'm not going to glue the shelves in place, but I am going to keep them there because they're going to help me with the clamping. So I've got some Titebond 3. I got my clamps. Let's do it. Let me give a big shout out to our superhero community over on Patreon. If you want to be a superhero just like Dan Brannigan did, you can check that out at patreon.com/NewtonMakes. All your support over there is a big help to the channel. It helps me to make better videos here on YouTube. I glued up a couple boards. That's going to be the back panel. And then I took the cabinet over to the router table, put in a rabbeting bit, and then cut out the rabbet on the back side of our cabinet. I went extra deep with this because I need enough room for this panel to fit inside of it, but also extra room for the French cleat. That's what's going to hold the cabinet to the wall. So now I have to make sure that my back panel is going to fit into place. So I set it on here. I got a pencil. I'm just gonna trace this out, and then I could use a jigsaw to cut it out the shape. I screwed the back panel in place, and I put all my shelves and dividers in there, and I could push them tight against that back. Now I can just mark them, and I know that's where I need to cut, so I can cut them to width, and all of this will be flush. The glue's dried on all my shelves and dividers, and I spent a couple hours doing some sanding, just kind of fine-tuning things. Looks great. At this point, we could throw a coat of finish on this, put a French cleat on the back, and call this whole thing done. But I still want to go that one step extra. I still want to put those drawers in there. So I've got some beautiful figured walnut. These are just some offcuts from a slab that I was working with for another project. I just think they would be really cool as some drawer fronts. So I'm going to go grab some scraps of wood and throw together some drawers. I need some sort of handle for this, and I found this piece of brass in my junk drawer, and I thought this would be kind of cool if I embed this in here like that, give me something to grab onto. So I need to take a router, route out of the groove so this will fit into there. You could cut soft metals like brass or aluminum with woodworking tools. Now, one thing that I like to do is sandwich it in between something else. Hardboard, piece of MDF, scrap wood, something like that. I just personally don't like having metal sliding around on my cast iron tabletop. It just feels like I don't have as much control over the item. I don't use a special metal cutting blade for this operation. I just have a backup saw blade that I use for this, and I've never had a problem with it. I figure it's much easier to cut the grooves for that brass now than it is to try to do that after the boxes are already assembled. So this operation is super simple. Just went over to the router table, put a couple stop blocks in there, and did a plunge cut, and the brass fit perfectly. Putting the boxes in the cabinet while the glue is drying will make sure that they're going to be a perfect fit. Now, while that's drying, I think I'm going to take some brass and put some pins here in the ends. That's going to look really cool, coordinate with the front here, but also strengthen up the joint. I usually opt for using CA glue whenever I'm sticking metal and wood together. So in this case, put a couple drops of CA glue in the holes I drilled out, tap in my brass pins, good to go. I polished up that brass with some 600 grit sandpaper, and it really shines. You can see the difference between the first box I did compared to the remaining box I still have to do. I also installed a French cleat on the back. This is just a piece of maple scrap that I had, cut it at a 45-degree angle and screwed it into place. So now this whole thing is done. It is time to finally apply finish. So I'm really excited about this. I'm going to apply some Osmo top oil. I'll apply several coats using a white Scotch-Brite pad. I'm applying it with a white Scotch-Brite pad. What I'm doing is I'm working it into the grain. And then once I do that, I'll wipe the whole thing down with a towel, come back, do it again, then let it sit for the rest of the day. Come back tomorrow, do the same thing, apply in a couple coats, and I'll just keep doing that until I get the sheen that I want. I like to really work that oil into the grain. I just don't think that you can do this too much. Oh man. Look at that, that looks fantastic. What an awesome project. I learned so much about bent lamination. Now I've got some ideas in my head about some future projects, but I have to say, I think my favorite part of this is those drawers. The figured walnut with the brass is just such a killer combination. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, consider subscribing to the channel. And until we meet again, get in your shop and build something awesome.